People who grew up in the 1990s don't always realize how different they are. Not on the surface. They look normal. They work, scroll, talk, laugh like everyone else. But underneath, something is different. They grew up in a narrow space in history, a quiet gap between two worlds. Before everything was recorded. Before attention became currency. Before childhood turned into content. And that gap shaped them in ways most people never talk about. If you grew up in the 1990s, you were raised at the edge of two realities. You remember a time when boredom existed. When silence wasn't uncomfortable. When you could disappear for hours and no one panicked. You remember calling friends without knowing if they'd be home. Knocking on doors. Memorizing phone numbers. Waiting. And waiting did something to your mind. Taught patience but also loneliness. It taught independence but also emotional distance. You learned early that not everything would respond instantly. And because of that, you learned how to sit with yourself. But no one taught you how to talk about what you felt while doing it. People who grew up in the 90s were often emotionally unsupervised. Not neglected, just unattended in a specific way. Parents were busy. Life was moving fast. And emotions were rarely discussed openly. You were taught how to behave, not how to process, so you learned to self-regulate by yourself. You learned to calm yourself down. You learned to figure things out internally. That became strength later. But it also became a wall. Because when you grow up learning to handle things alone, asking for help later feels unnatural, even shameful. You don't say, "I'm overwhelmed." You say, "I'm fine." And you mean it until you're not. People from the 1990s generation often struggle to explain what they're feeling. Not because they don't feel deeply, but because they feel too much without language. They were never given emotional vocabulary early on, so feelings stayed vague, heavy, unsorted. That's why many 90s kids grow up to be thinkers, overthinkers, observers. You learn to watch people carefully, to read moods, to sense tension. Because when emotions aren't talked about, they're felt instead. And that made you perceptive. But it also made you tired. Another thing that shaped you was the way joy worked back then. Joy was slower, terser, more earned. You waited all week for a TV show. You waited months for a game. You waited years for things to change. So when joy came, it landed deeper. But when disappointment came, it stayed longer too. That's why many people who grew up in the 90s feel a strange emptiness today. Even when life is good, they're surrounded by constant stimulation now. But none of it feels meaningful. They don't crave more content. They crave depth. They don't miss technology. They miss presence. And that creates a quiet grief they can't fully explain. Another hidden trait. People from the 1990s are deeply nostalgic, but not because the past was perfect. It wasn't. They're nostalgic because the past felt real, messy, unfiltered, unrecorded. Mistakes stayed local. Embarrassment faded with time. You weren't performing your life for an audience. And that freedom shaped your sense of identity. You learned who you were privately, before you learned who you were publicly. That's rare now. Which is why many 90s kids feel uncomfortable online, even though they use it constantly. They share selectively. They hold parts of themselves back. Not because they're hiding, but because they were raised to believe some things are meant to stay internal. This creates a split. On the outside they adapt. On the inside they resist. That's why people who grew up in the 90s often feel like they don't fully belong to modern culture, but also can't go back. They're stuck between eras. Too analog for the digital world. Too digital for the analog one. That tension shows up in relationships. They want closeness but need space. They crave intimacy but fear dependency. They value loyalty but struggle with vulnerability. They learned early that people leave, that things change, that nothing is guaranteed. So they love carefully. And when they do love deeply, they often overextend. They give more than they ask for. They tolerate more than they should. They stay quiet longer than is healthy. Because they were taught that endurance is maturity. Another thing few people talk about. People who grew up in the 90s are unusually good at being alone, but not always good at being with themselves. They can sit quietly. They can survive solitude. But their minds don't rest easily. Because silence used to be natural, now it feels intrusive. Their thoughts rush in when distractions stop. And that's why many 90s kids struggle with anxiety later in life. Not loud anxiety. Quiet anxiety. The kind that looks like constant mental noise. Low-level tension. A sense that something is always unfinished. They don't panic, they worry. They don't break, they slowly wear down. And often no one notices. 'Cause they're functional. Another hidden psychological effect. People from the 1990s often define themselves by competence. They pride themselves on being capable, reliable, low maintenance. They don't like being a burden, so they minimize their needs. They tell themselves, others have it worse. They push through. They delay rest. Until burnout arrives quietly, disguised as numbness. And that numbness confuses them, because they remember feeling intensely as kids. Music hit harder. Friendships felt everything or nothing. Life felt immediate. So when things feel dull now, they assume something is wrong with them. But nothing is wrong. Their nervous systems just grew up in a slower world. And now they're forced to live at a speed they were never designed for. One of the most overlooked traits of people who grew up in the 1990s is their relationship with meaning. They don't want shallow success. They want purpose. They question careers. They question systems. They question whether this is really it. And that makes them restless. They often feel behind, not because they failed but because they refused to rush. They didn't optimize their childhood. They lived it. And now they're trying to translate that depth into an adult world that rewards visibility over substance. That's hard. And it's lonely. But here's the truth most people miss. People who grew up in the 1990s carry something rare. They remember life before constant performance. Before constant comparison. Before identity became external. That gives them a unique advantage. If they learn to integrate it. Not by escaping the present. Not by romanticizing the past, but by bringing depth into a shallow world. By slowing down when everything speeds up. By choosing presence when everything demands attention. By valuing meaning over momentum. The hidden psychology of people who grew up in the 1990s isn't about damage. It's about adaptation. They learn to survive change early. They learn to translate worlds. They learn to live between eras. And once they stop seeing that as a weakness, it becomes their strength. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs people who remember what quiet felt like. And if you grew up in the 1990s, you're one of them.